The sonar operator was the first to notice it. At exactly 02:17 a.m., deep beneath the Atlantic, a sound appeared on the screen that should not have existed. It wasn't mechanical, it wasn't biological, and it wasn't random. It was pacing them. The American submarine had been submerged for over 40 hours, running silent under Cold War protocol. No active sonar, no unnecessary movement. Every man aboard knew that a single mistake could trigger an international incident, or worse. Then the object adjusted its speed perfectly, not reacting to water currents, not drifting, matching the submarine's course as if it knew where they were going before they did. The captain leaned closer to the screen. "Distance?" he asked. "Closing," the operator replied, "but it's below us, below." At a depth no known vessel could survive. The crew exchanged looks, tension spreading without a word spoken. Soviet technology didn't operate like this. Nothing on record did. The object emitted no propeller noise, no cavitation, no signature that matched any known underwater craft. Then it changed shape. Not physically, but acoustically. The sonar signature expanded, curved, then tightened again, like something flexing around its own mass. The screen flickered. A second operator confirmed the reading with a separate system. Same result. Whatever was following them was not hiding. It was letting itself be seen. The captain ordered a slight course correction. The object mirrored it instantly. That was the moment the room went silent. Because this wasn't surveillance, this was pursuit. And somewhere in the crushing black water beneath the submarine, something unknown was choosing to stay close. Close enough to make sure they understood one thing very clearly. They were no longer alone. What you just heard was never meant to leave the submarine. During the Cold War, incidents like this were classified at the highest level, not because they involved enemy nations, but because they involved something no nation could explain, control, or even acknowledge without admitting vulnerability. The crew aboard that American submarine was trained to expect pursuit. They were trained to expect Soviet vessels, underwater mines, false sonar echoes, even psychological pressure from long deployments beneath the ocean. What they were not trained for was something that followed them silently at impossible depths, with movements that suggested intention rather than technology. This story is based on accounts that remained buried for decades, passed quietly between former crew members, intelligence briefings marked restricted, and logs that were never officially released. It's not about proving what the object was. It's about understanding why it stayed. Before we go deeper, if you're interested in stories involving military operations, classified encounters, and unexplained phenomena that surfaced only years later, subscribe to Restricted Area Stories. This channel focuses on moments where trained professionals encountered something that didn't fit any doctrine or threat model. And let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? Because these encounters weren't isolated to one ocean, one decade, or one country. In the chapters ahead, you'll hear what the crew attempted next, how Naval Command responded when the report reached them, and why this particular encounter was treated differently from every other unexplained contact during the Cold War. The ocean hides more than wreckage. It hides things that watch, follow, and sometimes choose to reveal themselves. And once a submarine crew realizes they're being followed by something that doesn't belong to any known fleet, the mission is no longer just about survival. It becomes about containment. The submarine's control room smelled like warm electronics and recycled air, an odor every submariner learned to stop noticing after the first week. Red lights kept the crew's night vision intact. Voices stayed low by habit even when nothing was technically wrong, until the sonar board began to look wrong. Chief Petty Officer Len Hargrove had been in sonar long enough to trust patterns more than instincts. Patterns never lied. Men did, machines did, nerves did, but patterns didn't. The trace on the screen wasn't a whale. Whales wandered. They didn't maintain a parallel track at constant range. It wasn't another submarine. Submarines created noise, tiny, telltale artifacts. A pump cycle, a bearing signature, the faint irritation of cavitation when someone got impatient. This thing produced none of it. It was clean. Too clean. Hargrove ran the classification routine anyway, because that's what you do when you're trained to distrust your own disbelief. "Con," he said into the sound-powered phone, voice controlled. "Sonar. Possible contact bearing 083, range fluctuating, tracking our course." The helmsman didn't turn his head. Nobody did. In a control room, overreacting was worse than underreacting. You kept your hands steady. You kept your voice boring. The officer of the deck, Lieutenant Marston, stepped in behind Hargrove and studied the display. "Type?" Marston asked. Hargrove hesitated. That pause drew attention faster than any alarm. "Unknown," he said. "No propeller signature, no biologics. It's pacing us." Marston's jaw tightened. "Below us?" "Yes, sir. Well below." Marston turned slightly toward the navigation plot. "What depth?" "Hard to pin down," Hargrove said. "But it's deep. Deep enough it should be crushed if it's built like anything we know." The captain entered without announcement. Commander Robert Klein, lean and quiet, the kind of officer who didn't waste movement. He listened for 15 seconds without speaking, reading the room through posture and tone. Then he leaned toward the sonar display, as if the screen could feel his authority. "Repeat your last," Klein said. Hargrove swallowed. "Sir, sonar contact is matching our speed and heading. It's holding station below us at an impossible depth." Klein didn't react emotionally. He reacted tactically. "Speed?" he asked. "Contact mirrors at our current 5 knots. Klein looked at Marston. "We're running passive only, correct?" "Yes, sir." "Any chance it's a false return, thermal layer, bottom bounce?" Hargrove shook his head, then caught himself and answered properly. "Negative, Captain. 2 independent arrays confirm. Different processing, same result." The captain stared at the trace, then gave his first order. "Helm," he said, voice calm. "Come right 10 degrees. Maintain depth." "Aye, sir." The submarine adjusted course with a subtle, almost lazy obedience. Steel shifted. Water pressure changed. Nothing dramatic. Hargrove watched the sonar trace. The unknown contact adjusted within seconds, sliding into the new parallel track, as if it had been waiting for the decision. A few men exchanged looks, tiny movements, controlled faces. Nobody spoke, but the message was shared instantly. "It's responding to us." Marston leaned closer. "How fast did it match?" "Immediate," Hargrove said. "No lag." Klein's eyes didn't leave the screen. "Slow us to 3 knots." The engine order was executed quietly. The submarine's internal rhythm changed, like a heartbeat lowering. The trace lowered too. "Contact matched," Hargrove reported, voice tighter now. "Holding." The captain made another adjustment. "Depth change, down 20 feet. The ballast system hissed softly. The boat descended. The trace followed again, still below them, still clean, still persistent. The control room grew colder in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the cold of realization. The crew wasn't being coincidentally accompanied. They were being studied, or escorted, or hunted. Klein held his composure because that was his job. But he didn't pretend this was normal. "Mr. Marston," he said, "log it as an unknown underwater contact maintaining station. Timestamp everything." "Yes, sir." Klein turned slightly toward the radio room. "Any incoming traffic?" "Negative, Captain," the radio man replied. "We're scheduled to transmit at 600. Until then, we stay dark." The captain nodded once. Stay dark. That was the rule. In the Cold War, breaking radio silence could be interpreted as fear, or worse, an active operation. Klein's eyes returned to the sonar board. "Any indication it's Soviet?" Hargrove exhaled. "Captain, I've listened to Soviet boats. Their signatures are like fingerprints. This doesn't have a fingerprint. It's like a shadow that makes its own rules." Klein didn't allow poetic language to take over the room. He needed something actionable. "Range?" he asked. "Closing slowly," Hargrove said. "Not aggressively, like it's measuring us." Then something happened that made the hair on Hargrove's arms rise under his uniform. A second trace appeared, briefly, on a different bearing. Not a second contact, a shift. Like the object had moved around them without traveling the long way. Hargrove leaned in. "Sir, it just repositioned." "Repositioned how?" Marston asked. "It's now off our port quarter, still below. Same signature. It didn't accelerate like a craft would. It's like it folded into a new place." Klein made a decision then that could have ended careers, if wrong. "Rig for active sonar," he said. The room stiffened. Active sonar was a flare in the dark. It told anything listening exactly where you were. It was not used casually, especially not in contested waters. Marston hesitated. "Captain." "I know," Klein snapped quietly. Not angry, decisive. "I want one pulse, narrow beam, minimal exposure." "Aye, sir." The sonar team prepared. Hargrove's fingers hovered over controls he'd been taught to treat, like a last resort. One pulse could confirm range and shape. One pulse could also invite something to answer. "Fire," Klein ordered. The active ping went out, an invisible shout through black water. Seconds passed. Then the return came back, and it didn't look like any submarine, any whale, any known structure. The echo was wrong. Too smooth, too curved, too large in a way that didn't align with how it had been tracking them. "Captain," Hargrove said, voice barely above a whisper now. "I'm getting a shape. It's not a hull. It's like an oval, under them, keeping pace. At a depth where an oval shouldn't exist unless physics was optional." The captain stared at the screen and didn't blink. "Stay steady," he ordered the room, as much for himself as for them. "No panic, no heroics." Then, as if reacting to the active sonar pulse, not with anger but with intent, the contact surged upward. Not all the way to them, just close enough that the range numbers changed fast. Close enough to make every man in that room feel the same thought without speaking it. It heard us, and now it was letting them know it could get closer whenever it wanted. The surge stopped just short of collision range. Numbers stabilized. The oval trace settled again beneath the submarine, close enough now that no one in the control room needed the sonar screen to feel it. Pressure did that work for them. The hull creaked. Not from stress beyond tolerance, but from the quiet reminder that thousands of tons of water were stacked above and below them, waiting for permission to crush steel. Commander Klein did not raise his voice. "Report," he said. Hargrove swallowed. "Contact halted its ascent at 300 yards below us, sir. Holding position. Same bearing." Marston leaned over the plot. "Any sign of weapons, emissions, power spikes?" "Negative," Hargrove replied. "No thermal bloom, no electrical noise. It's steady." That steadiness unsettled them more than aggression would have. Soviet boats probed, bluffed, postured. This thing behaved like it had nothing to prove. Klein made the next decision with care. "Helm, maintain course. Reduce speed to 2 knots. The submarine slowed to a crawl, becoming a shadow in its own right. The oval below mirrored the change again. No lag, no overshoot, no noise. Marston exhaled through his nose. "It's anticipating." Klein didn't correct him. Anticipation implied awareness. Awareness implied intent. Both were possibilities he couldn't afford to ignore. "Sonar," Klein said. "Any chance it's riding a layer? Something refracting our returns?" Hargrove shook his head. "Captain, we've adjusted filters. We've checked layers. Whatever this is, it's independent." Silence returned, heavy and deliberate. Men avoided eye contact. Training kept them functional, but training had not prepared them for something that refused classification. The radio room crackled softly. The radio man leaned out. "Captain, we're approaching our scheduled transmit window." Klein hesitated. Breaking silence meant attention, but not reporting meant responsibility without guidance. "Prepare a burst," he said finally. "Encrypted, minimal detail. Unknown underwater contact, impossible depth, maintaining station." Marston looked at him. "That'll raise flags." Klein met his eyes. "Good. I want flags." The transmission went out, a brief coded whisper into the upper world. Then the boat returned to radio silence. Moments later, the oval shifted again, not laterally, vertically. It dropped. Fast. Hargrove leaned in. "Captain, contact descending. Rates extreme." "How extreme?" Klein asked. Hargrove checked, recalculated, checked again. "Sir, it's exceeding safe descent for any known craft. It's going deeper." "How deep?" Marston pressed. Hargrove's voice thinned. "Beyond our crush depth. Beyond any crush depth." The oval faded, not vanished, but retreated into a region where sonar returned only suggestion, not certainty. The water swallowed it without turbulence, without the chaos that physics usually demanded. A long exhale moved through the control room. Relief tried to surface. Klein didn't allow it. "Maintain course," he said. "No changes." 10 minutes passed, then 20. The trace did not return. Men resumed tasks. Shoulders loosened a fraction. The submarine continued its patrol, the ocean once again behaving like an ocean, until the lights flickered. Not out. Just enough. Hargrove looked up. "Electrical fluctuation." The engineer answered from his station. "Negative, Captain. Reactors stable." Another flicker followed, brief, localized like a blink, then sonar lit up. "Contact reacquired," Hargrove said sharply. "Same signature, now above us." Above, Klein's jaw set. "Bearing? Directly overhead, range closing." Marston's voice dropped. "That's impossible." Hargrove didn't argue. "Captain, it's matching our movements again, but from above." The implications settled like ice. The object had moved from below to above, without passing around them in any detectable way. It hadn't traveled through the water in a manner sonar could follow. It had simply reappeared. Klein made the call that would later be debated in rooms none of these men would ever enter. "All stop," he ordered. The submarine halted, suspended in black water. Silence deepened until even breath felt loud. The oval stopped too. For the first time since contact, both vessels, if that word still applied, were motionless, waiting. Hargrove watched the display as the oval's outline changed subtly, its echo flexing and compressing, as if responding to the submarine's stillness. No spikes, no signals, just a presence that seemed to acknowledge the pause. Then something unprecedented happened. A sound appeared on sonar that wasn't a return. It was a pattern, 3 pulses, evenly spaced, not loud, not aggressive, not natural. Hargrove's hands trembled despite himself. "Captain, it's emitting." "Record everything," Klein said. "Don't interpret." The pulses repeated, 3 again, then a longer pause, then 3 more. Marston frowned. "That's not noise." "No," Hargrove said quietly. "It's structured." The room felt smaller. Steel walls pressed inward as men confronted the possibility that whatever was outside wasn't merely observing. It was communicating, or at least signaling recognition. Klein made a choice that would never be written down. "Sonar," he said. "Respond. Mirror the pattern. Low power." Marston snapped his head toward him. "Captain." "One response," Klein cut in. "If it's a mistake, we'll know. If it's not, we'll also know." Hargrove adjusted settings, heart hammering. He sent 3 low-energy pings, evenly spaced, matching the pattern. The ocean held its breath. Then the oval moved, not closer, away. It drifted off the sonar display in a smooth, controlled arc, accelerating without noise, without turbulence, until it vanished into depths the submarine could never follow. No flicker, no retaliation, no pursuit, just departure. The control room remained frozen for a full minute after the last trace disappeared. Finally, Klein spoke. "Log time of departure. Mark contact as unknown. No speculation." "Aye, sir," Marston said. The patrol continued, but nothing felt routine again. Hours later, Naval Command responded, not with questions but with orders. The submarine was instructed to alter patrol parameters and avoid the area indefinitely. No follow-up requests, no demand for clarification, just avoidance. That, more than anything, unsettled Klein. When institutions avoid instead of investigate, it means someone already knows more than they're saying. The crew completed the mission without further incident. The oval did not return. The ocean resumed its impersonation of emptiness, but every man aboard carried the same private understanding back to the surface. They had not encountered an enemy. They had encountered something that chose to engage, and then chose to disengage, on its terms. And somewhere in the vast cold water beneath Cold War tensions and human assumptions, something had learned exactly how closely an American submarine could be followed, without ever being caught. Naval intelligence did not ask for clarification. That was the first sign this incident was different. Commander Klein expected questions, requests for raw data, follow-up interviews, secondary verification. Instead, the response came as a short, tightly worded directive routed through channels he had only seen used once before. Stand by. Maintain silence. Await debrief. No mention of the object. No reference to the active sonar exchange. No curiosity. Only control. Within 48 hours of surfacing, the submarine was diverted to a port that wasn't on its original itinerary. The crew was told it was a routine reassignment. No one believed that. Routine didn't involve sealed conference rooms, temporary security badges, or men in civilian clothes who never gave their names. The debrief began without ceremony. Klein was escorted into a windowless room with 3 men seated at a table, no ranks displayed, no introductions offered. A tape recorder sat between them, already running. "Commander," one of the men said, flipping open a folder thicker than the patrol log itself, "we're not here to determine what you encountered." Klein waited. "We're here to determine what you did when you encountered it." That distinction mattered. They went through the encounter minute by minute, course changes, speed adjustments, the decision to use active sonar, the 3-pulse exchange, the object's retreat. No one interrupted. When Klein finished, one of the men slid a photograph across the table. It showed a sonar screen. Not his. Older, different vessel, same oval. Klein's breath slowed. "How many?" he asked. The man didn't answer directly. "Enough," he said, "and not all of them American." That was the second sign this incident wasn't isolated. The intelligence officer leaned back. "These encounters don't follow geopolitical lines. They follow patterns." "Patterns of what?" Klein asked. The man tapped the folder. "Patrol routes, silent running, strategic assets." Another officer spoke for the first time. "Every confirmed incident involves a platform carrying something worth monitoring. Nuclear capability, early warning systems, command and control assets." Klein felt a chill that had nothing to do with water temperature. "You're saying it wasn't random," he said. "No," the officer replied. "We're saying it was selective." They showed him more material. Redacted logs from Allied submarines, a British vessel in the Norwegian Sea, a French patrol in the Mediterranean, even a Soviet report, sanitized, indirect but unmistakable in its description. Oval, silent, impossible depth, perfect tracking, and in every case the object disengaged after demonstrating superiority, not aggression. "Why pull away?" Klein asked. "If it can follow, match, reposition, why leave?" The man with the folder closed it slowly. "Because leaving sends a message," he said. "It says, we don't need to stay." Klein understood immediately. The most unsettling encounters aren't the ones that escalate. They're the ones that end voluntarily. The crew was never formally debriefed as a group. Each man was questioned individually, reminded of classification protocols, and quietly reassigned after the patrol ended. No commendations, no reprimands, just dispersion. Hargrove was transferred to a shore-based analysis unit. Marston took a billet, far from operational command. None of it was framed as punishment, but none of it felt accidental. The message was clear. This experience would not be repeated casually. Back at command, analysts worked in parallel cells, comparing data across decades. They overlaid patrol routes with geopolitical flashpoints. They mapped the object's appearances against moments of heightened tension. The pattern sharpened. The encounters clustered around escalation thresholds, times when human systems were closest to irreversible decisions. Launch readiness, alert posture changes, strategic movement. The object, or whatever controlled it, appeared not during war but during almost war, as if monitoring the moments that mattered most. One analyst phrased it carefully in a memo that never left the building. The phenomenon demonstrates interest in capability, not conflict. That line was underlined twice. The Cold War was not about battlefields, it was about restraint, about proving you could destroy the world without needing to. And something in the ocean appeared to be watching that proof being assembled. Klein was called in one final time. A senior officer, this one with rank clearly displayed, looked at him across a polished desk. "You did exactly what we would have done," the officer said, "and exactly what we won't do again." Klein frowned. "Meaning?" "If this happens again," the officer said, "we do not respond. We observe, we log, we do not engage." "Even if it approaches?" Klein asked. "Especially if it approaches." The implication was heavy. They were not afraid of attack. They were afraid of acknowledgement. The officer leaned forward. "Commander, if this is intelligence, foreign or otherwise, we don't want it knowing how we react when we realize we're being watched." Klein nodded slowly. He understood now why the object had left after the exchange. It hadn't been threatened, it had been answered, and that answer had been enough. Years later, long after the Cold War began its slow unraveling, Klein would still think about the moment the Oval retreated into the depths, not with fear, but with unease, because predators don't usually announce themselves. Observers do, and observers leave when they've learned what they came for. The reports didn't arrive all at once. They never did. They surfaced slowly, separated by years, oceans, and flags, connected only by details that refused to stay buried. Anomalies in sonar logs that didn't match training errors, crew statements that sounded too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, encounters classified so deeply that even their existence was denied outside a handful of rooms. Naval intelligence learned to read between absences. In one case, a patrol in the Southern Ocean recorded an unknown contact that remained just beyond sensor range for 11 hours. It never crossed into detection thresholds that would trigger alarms. It simply stayed adjacent. When the submarine altered depth, the contact adjusted. When the patrol went silent, the contact became quieter. No engagement, no signal, no departure. The object vanished only when the submarine surfaced. In another incident, a NATO vessel detected an underwater mass moving faster than any torpedo on record, yet producing no wake, no cavitation, no thermal trace. The officer who logged it used a single phrase before the line was redacted. "It behaved like it knew what we were looking for." Patterns emerged. The encounters always involved strategic assets. They never resulted in damage. They never escalated into confrontation. And most unsettling of all, they never repeated in the same location twice. This wasn't surveillance in the human sense. It was sampling. Analysts began to shift their language. Not officially, not in documents that would circulate, but in closed-door conversations where precision mattered more than optics. They stopped asking what the object was. They started asking why it chose restraint. One theory gained traction quietly. The phenomenon wasn't interested in weapons. It was interested in decision-making, in how humans behaved when they realized they were no longer the apex presence in a controlled environment. The submarine encounters weren't tests of firepower, they were tests of discipline. Did crews panic? Did command escalate? Did humans reveal patterns when confronted with the unknown? Commander Klein's encounter was flagged repeatedly in this context. Not because of the object's behavior, but because of his response. He had broken protocol only once, the mirrored sonar pulse. That moment became a dividing line in analysis. Before the pulse, the object tracked and repositioned. After the pulse, it withdrew permanently. Some analysts argued that the exchange signaled recognition. Others believed it marked comprehension, that the object had confirmed something about human response and no longer needed proximity. A dissenting voice raised a more troubling possibility. What if it left, the analyst asked, because it decided this platform wasn't the one it was waiting for? That question was never written down. It didn't need to be. By the late stages of the Cold War, directives were quietly updated. Submarine crews received new language during classified briefings, phrasing that sounded benign but carried weight. Unidentified underwater phenomena may be observed. Do not pursue. Do not challenge. Do not respond unless directly threatened. Threat, notably, was never defined. This ambiguity was intentional. Meanwhile, sailors talked, not openly but in fragments, in stories that sounded exaggerated until you compared details, in shared looks between men who had seen something they were never supposed to name. Hargrove, now working in acoustic analysis, noticed something that unsettled him deeply. The oval signature, once thought singular, had variations, not enough to classify as different craft, enough to suggest adaptation. The phenomenon wasn't static, it was learning. At a closed symposium attended by senior defense analysts, a question was posed that reframed everything. What if the ocean isn't hiding them? One participant asked. What if it's where they can observe us without interference? No one answered immediately, because the implication was clear. If the phenomenon was aquatic by choice, then space wasn't the only domain where humanity was being watched. The ocean covered most of the planet, and humans had barely mapped it. As decades passed, the Cold War thawed, but the encounters didn't stop. They simply became less urgent to report. The absence of conflict made anomalies easier to ignore, easier to misfile, until one final data set changed the conversation entirely. An analyst noticed that the frequency of encounters dropped sharply after the early 1990s, not gradually, abruptly. The same period marked a decline in continuous submarine patrols carrying nuclear payloads at maximum readiness. The conclusion was uncomfortable. The phenomenon wasn't reacting to humans, it was reacting to risk. When the risk of global escalation diminished, so did the need for observation, which meant one thing: if that risk ever returned, if humans once again positioned themselves at the edge of irreversible decisions, the observers might return too. And next time, they might not bother leaving so clearly. Commander Klein, long retired, was asked once, off the record, what he believed the object was. He didn't speculate. He answered with certainty. Whatever it was, he said, it wasn't surprised by us. That certainty haunted the analysts more than any theory, because surprise implies discovery, and discovery implies novelty. Nothing about that encounter felt novel. It felt overdue. The fragments surfaced without ceremony. No press release, no official declassification announcement, just a quietly unsealed document slipped into a digital archive where only specialists ever looked. It was labeled as a supplemental acoustic anomaly review, dated nearly 15 years after Commander Klein's patrol, and it contained a single paragraph that changed how analysts understood everything that had come before. The patrol Klein commanded had not been random. It had been repositioned 3 weeks earlier, its route adjusted under a pretext so minor no one aboard questioned it. At the time, the explanation had been framed as logistical: fuel efficiency, updated intelligence priorities, a routine correction. The fragment revealed otherwise. The submarine had been placed deliberately along a corridor where undersea communication traffic spiked unpredictably. Not Soviet traffic, not NATO traffic. Something else. Bursts of low-frequency noise that didn't align with tectonic activity or known marine patterns. Those bursts had preceded 3 earlier encounters with the oval object. Klein's submarine wasn't followed by coincidence. It had been placed in the path. Analysts reviewing the fragment realized something unsettling. Naval Command hadn't been blind when Klein sent his report. They had been cautious. They suspected contact before it happened. The document referenced an internal hypothesis never shared with crews, that certain strategic movements acted as signals, unintentionally broadcasting human readiness states into environments humans barely monitored. The ocean, it suggested, functioned as a passive amplifier, not for sound alone, but for intent. Submarines carrying deterrent payloads moved differently. Their patterns were tighter, their routes more deliberate, their silence more purposeful. Those characteristics created signatures, not acoustic in the traditional sense, but behavioral. Something was reading those signatures. The fragment included a hand-drawn diagram scanned into the file. It showed patrol routes overlaid with encounter locations. The oval's appearances clustered around decision nodes, places where command authority, payload capability, and geopolitical tension converged. The phenomenon wasn't interested in geography, it was interested in thresholds. That explained why the object had disengaged after Klein's sonar response. The pulse wasn't interpreted as aggression, it was interpreted as acknowledgement. The submarine had crossed from unaware to aware. Observation was complete. What unsettled analysts most wasn't the implication of intelligence, it was the implication of patience. The object did not force interaction. It waited until conditions aligned. It withdrew once its objective, whatever that was, had been met. Years later, a similar fragment emerged from an Allied archive. This one referenced an exercise in the Pacific that was aborted without explanation. The reason, buried in a footnote, cited persistent anomalous underwater proximity to a command vessel during a simulated escalation scenario. The same oval, different ocean, same behavior. The pattern now spanned decades. By the time these fragments were cross-referenced, the Cold War was long over. The urgency had faded, but the implications hadn't. Analysts began to ask a question no one wanted to formalize. What if the phenomenon wasn't monitoring weapons, but judgment? Submarines were unique in that way. They were mobile, silent, and capable of acting independently. Their crews operated under immense pressure, guided by rules designed to prevent catastrophic mistakes. If something wanted to understand how humans made irreversible decisions, there was no better laboratory. Commander Klein was contacted again, this time unofficially. A retired analyst visited him under the guise of an oral history project. No recorders, no forms, just a question. Why do you think it left when it did? Klein didn't hesitate. Because we showed restraint, he said. And because we didn't chase. The analyst pressed. What if you had? Klein's eyes narrowed. Then we'd have told it we don't know when to stop. That answer never made it into any report. But it circulated. The fragment ended with a line that chilled anyone who read it closely. Observation events correlate with periods of heightened deterrent readiness. Absence of events may indicate satisfaction, not disappearance. Satisfaction, as if something had been checking in, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. And as the world entered a new era of rising tensions, analysts quietly wondered whether the phenomenon would return to confirm something else. Not what humans could do, but whether they still deserved the benefit of restraint. The final Cold War-era incident did not begin in crisis. It began in routine, a joint naval exercise in the North Atlantic, late 1980s. Multiple Allied submarines operating under strict simulation parameters. No live payloads, no active sonar unless authorized. Everything controlled, everything rehearsed. That was the assumption. What planners didn't know, or didn't acknowledge, was that this exercise placed 3 submarines inside overlapping deterrent corridors at the same time. Individually, the routes were unremarkable. Together, they created a convergence of intent that had never occurred during peacetime operations. Someone or something noticed. The first indication came not from sonar, but from navigation. One vessel reported minor inertial drift, fractions of a degree that corrected themselves before alarms triggered. Another logged transient compass discrepancies that disappeared upon recalibration. Each anomaly was dismissed independently, until sonar lit up, not with a contact, with absence. Operators noticed regions where background noise dropped unnaturally low, as if the ocean itself were dampening sound. No biologics, no distant shipping, no seismic hum. Silence that felt manufactured. Then the oval appeared. Not beneath one submarine, but centered between all 3, perfectly positioned. Its depth placed it beyond engagement range. Its distance placed it beyond collision risk. Its presence forced a question no doctrine had prepared for. Who was it watching? Command struggled with response options. Active sonar risked escalation. Maneuvering risked misinterpretation. Doing nothing risked something worse. Acknowledgement through paralysis. The oval did not advance. It waited. Minutes stretched. Crew members felt time slow in a way no drill had ever produced. This was not pressure from the enemy. This was pressure from uncertainty. One captain, later reprimanded quietly, authorized a slight course adjustment. The oval mirrored it. Another submarine changed depth. The oval adjusted again. The pattern was undeniable. It was monitoring the group as a system, not as individuals. A senior officer on the exercise command ship issued a coded directive: hold position, maintain silence, no escalation. That order likely prevented history from breaking, because the next event pushed the encounter to its edge. One submarine detected a brief energy fluctuation, not a weapon signature, not propulsion, but something like a localized distortion. Instruments disagreed on how to interpret it. Some logged a spike, others logged a void. The oval did not move. It changed orientation. That was the moment analysts later identified as critical. Orientation implies perspective. Something was aligning itself, not to attack, not to flee, but to observe from a new angle. Then, without warning, a low-frequency pulse rippled outward. Not loud, not violent, but deep enough that every submarine detected it simultaneously. It wasn't a signal in any known language. It wasn't communication in the human sense. It was synchronization. Every clock aboard the submarines drifted by the same fraction of a second. Every system registered the same micro-delay. For a brief, terrifying moment, 3 independent command structures were forced into the same temporal hiccup. Then the oval vanished. No acceleration, no retreat path, no turbulence, gone. The exercise was terminated immediately. Official reports blamed system interference, navigation anomalies, environmental factors, nothing extraordinary. Privately, analysts reached a conclusion that never appeared in print. The phenomenon had not been testing weapons, it had been testing coordination. It wanted to know whether multiple human-controlled deterrent systems could act independently, or whether they would collapse into collective error under observation. The answer that day had been restraint. Years later, reviewing the incident, one analyst wrote a single line in the margin of a classified memo: "It disengaged when we stopped trying to decide." That line survived every redaction because it explained everything. The phenomenon did not escalate because escalation wasn't the point. It observed until uncertainty peaked, then withdrew once it learned what it needed. And what it learned perhaps was this: Humanity's greatest threat wasn't aggression, it was hesitation at scale. As the Cold War ended, the Oval did not return. Not publicly, not detectably, but analysts never assumed absence. They assumed dormancy. Because observers don't disappear when the experiment pauses. They wait for the next condition to emerge. And deep beneath the ocean, where pressure hides movement and silence carries meaning, something that had watched humanity balance on the edge of annihilation may still be listening. Not for noise, but for intent. Decades later, the changes were visible only to those who knew where to look. Public doctrine evolved the way it always does, through sanitized language and vague justifications. New training manuals emphasized de-escalation in anomalous encounters. Silent running protocols were refined. Active sonar authorization became more restrictive in certain regions, without explanation that satisfied even experienced officers. To the outside world, it looked like modernization. To the analysts who had studied the Oval encounters, it looked like memory. Navies do not admit fear, they encode it. One retired strategist described it this way: "We didn't change because we were attacked. We changed because we were measured." That measurement lingered. Modern submarines were equipped with better sensors, but crews were taught a paradoxical lesson. Sometimes the correct response to the unknown is to remain unreadable. Not passive, not frozen, simply opaque. Exercises began including scenarios labeled only as environmental anomalies. In these drills, the objective wasn't to identify or neutralize a contact. It was to maintain decision integrity under observation. That phrasing raised eyebrows. Observation by whom? The answer was never spoken. Meanwhile, data quietly accumulated. Autonomous sensors placed along undersea cables occasionally recorded disturbances that matched none of the usual suspects. No seismic event. No marine life, no known craft. Analysts logged them, flagged them, then filed them away. Patterns were noted, always near infrastructure, always near strategic nodes, never lingering long enough to force confrontation. The Oval was never directly recorded again, but its absence carried the same signature as its presence had: precision. One modern incident nearly broke the silence. A nuclear-powered submarine operating in the Pacific detected a transient object moving at depth during a high-alert patrol. The contact lasted 90 seconds, no visual confirmation, no pursuit. The crew followed protocol perfectly. They did nothing. Later, during debrief, an intelligence officer asked the captain a single question: "Why didn't you respond?" The captain answered without hesitation: "Because it didn't want us to." That response ended the conversation. It also confirmed something analysts had long suspected. The phenomenon had influenced not just equipment and rules, but intuition. Generations of submariners had inherited caution without knowing its origin. The Cold War encounters had become institutional instinct, and instincts persist. At a closed conference attended by military planners and civilian scientists, one presenter showed a timeline of unexplained underwater anomalies, overlaid with global tension indexes. The correlation wasn't perfect, but it was compelling. Spikes in observation aligned with spikes in human uncertainty. When deterrence systems were stressed, the ocean seemed to watch more closely. One scientist raised a question that made the room go quiet. "What if we're not being monitored for aggression?" she said, "but for coherence." Coherence, whether systems designed to prevent catastrophe could still function when pushed to ambiguity. In that context, the Oval's behavior made unsettling sense. It never attacked. It never warned. It never revealed itself fully. It simply stayed close enough to matter. The idea that something might be evaluating humanity's capacity for restraint rather than dominance unsettled traditional frameworks. It inverted assumptions about threat. The danger wasn't invasion, it was judgment. Commander Klein's encounter was revisited one last time in an internal review marking the anniversary of the Cold War's end. Analysts noted that his submarine had demonstrated three things in sequence: recognition, restraint, withdrawal. That sequence became a quiet benchmark, not because it proved success, but because it avoided failure. One analyst summarized it bluntly: "We passed without knowing the test." As geopolitical tensions rose again in the modern era, a handful of officials revisited old protocols, not to reactivate them, but to understand their origin. Why certain depths were avoided, why certain responses were discouraged, why silence was sometimes preferred over clarity. The answer, buried in redacted archives and half-remembered briefings, was simple and terrifying. Something had once followed them beneath the ocean. It had learned how they behaved when watched. And it had decided, at least for the moment, that humanity was capable of stopping itself. Whether that assessment still held was an open question, one no one wanted answered too loudly. The fear was never that the phenomenon would return. The fear was that it already had, just not in ways humans were prepared to notice. Analysts, reviewing decades of Cold War-era material, began to understand something uncomfortable. The Oval had never required proximity to observe effectively. It had approached submarines not because it needed to, but because it wanted confirmation. Once confirmation was achieved, distance became irrelevant. That realization reframed everything. If the phenomenon could learn from limited interaction, sonar pulses, maneuver responses, hesitation under pressure, then future observation wouldn't require dramatic encounters. It could be passive, distributed, embedded within environments humans assumed were inert. The ocean was merely the first classroom. A senior analyst, speaking off the record years later, summarized the shift in thinking bluntly. "We stopped asking where it was. We started asking where it wouldn't need to be." The answer was disturbing. Modern deterrence no longer relied solely on submarines. Decision systems had expanded into networks, satellites, automated warning platforms, algorithm-assisted response chains. Human judgment still existed, but it was increasingly mediated, and mediation left fingerprints. If the Oval, or whatever controlled it, had been evaluating coherence and restraint, then the question wasn't whether it could observe humanity again. It was whether humanity was still observable as a single decision-making entity at all. Fragmentation introduced risk. One classified briefing explored a hypothetical future encounter. Not with a submarine, but with an automated defense system misinterpreting anomalous data. The scenario ended poorly, not because of aggression, but because no human intervened in time. That scenario never left the room. It didn't need to. The lesson was absorbed quietly. Restraint required presence. Someone had to be there to choose not to escalate. That realization reshaped doctrine in subtle ways. Humans were reinserted into loops that automation had begun to bypass. Decision windows were widened, redundancies added not for speed, but for pause. These changes were never attributed to unidentified phenomena. They were framed as ethical safeguards, but the analysts knew better. The Oval had not threatened humanity. It had revealed humanity's own vulnerabilities. Commander Klein's encounter became a case study in what not to formalize. It wasn't about tactics, it was about psychology. About what happens when humans realize they are not the sole observers in environments they believed were private. One younger analyst asked a question during a late-night session that made the room go still. "What if the Oval was never judging us as a threat?" he said. "What if it was deciding whether we were stable?" Stability implied responsibility. It implied that power, once recognized, came with expectations. No one answered him directly, because no one wanted to speculate about the criteria. In the years that followed, anomalous underwater readings continued, rare, fleeting, ambiguous. None escalated, none lingered. Each reinforced the same conclusion. The phenomenon did not seek dominance, it sought understanding, and understanding, once achieved, did not require repetition. As the Cold War receded into history, the oval's absence became its loudest statement. It suggested satisfaction, or at least conditional trust. But trust, analysts knew, was provisional. One final internal memo, circulated among a handful of agencies, ended with a sentence that summarized decades of observation. Restraint appears to discourage engagement. That sentence carried weight far beyond its simplicity. It meant that escalation invited attention, that panic invited scrutiny, that calm, real calm, signaled maturity. The ocean, vast and unreadable, had once hosted a silent test of humanity's self-control. Humanity unknowingly had passed. For now. Because tests are rarely administered only once, and observers who wait do not forget what they have learned. The concern inside intelligence circles was no longer whether the phenomenon would reappear. It was whether it had ever truly left. By the early 2000s, analysts reviewing Cold War material began reaching a shared conclusion. The oval had never required constant presence to accomplish its objective. Its brief, deliberate encounters had been sufficient to establish a behavioral baseline. Once that baseline was understood, repetition became unnecessary. Observation had given way to assessment. This realization forced a re-evaluation of how humanity understood surveillance. The phenomenon had not behaved like a scout or a probe. It did not map terrain, catalog defenses, or test reactions repeatedly. Instead, it appeared at moments of peak consequence, observed response under pressure, and disengaged once behavior stabilized. That pattern suggested intention and patience. One senior analyst summarized it in a closed session. It wasn't watching what we had. It was watching how we decided. That insight changed the tone of subsequent briefings. The question was no longer, what was it? But what did it conclude? The Cold War encounters all shared a defining feature. Restraint emerged at the critical moment. Commanders chose not to escalate. Crews resisted the urge to challenge. Systems hesitated instead of reacting reflexively. Those decisions mattered, because from the phenomenon's perspective, restraint was data. In later years, as deterrent systems evolved, analysts worried that the conditions which once demonstrated human restraint were disappearing. Automation reduced hesitation. Algorithms compressed decision windows. Human judgment was increasingly framed as a bottleneck rather than a safeguard. If the phenomenon had been evaluating stability, then speed posed a problem. One classified simulation explored this concern explicitly. In the scenario, an automated early warning system misclassified an anomalous signal. Human oversight existed, but the window for intervention was measured in seconds. The simulation concluded with irreversible escalation. No malice, no intent, just momentum. The takeaway was stark. Restraint required time, and time was being engineered out of the system. This realization triggered quiet policy shifts. Decision chains were lengthened, manual confirmations reinstated, redundancies introduced not to increase reliability, but to slow outcomes just enough for judgment to intervene. Officially, these changes were framed as ethical safeguards. Unofficially, they were treated as compliance. Compliance with what exactly remained unspoken. One analyst raised a question that no one wanted to answer directly. What if the phenomenon isn't monitoring threats, but monitoring readiness to stop? If that were true, then the Cold War encounters took on a different meaning. The Oval had not been warning humanity. It had been verifying something, and verification, once complete, did not need repetition. This interpretation also explained the phenomenon's absence during lower tension periods. When systems were relaxed, when deterrence postures softened, observation was unnecessary. The conditions being evaluated were no longer present, but when tensions rose again, even briefly, anomalous data points appeared, fleeting, ambiguous, never enough to force confrontation, just enough to remind analysts that observation could resume if needed. Commander Klein's encounter became emblematic, not because it was dramatic, but because it ended correctly. The mirrored sonar pulse, once debated as a mistake, was later reframed as acknowledgement without aggression. It signaled awareness without challenge. The phenomenon responded by disengaging. That exchange became a silent reference point, not a protocol, not a guideline, a precedent. One analyst phrased it carefully in an internal note. The phenomenon appears sensitive to intention rather than action. That line circulated quietly. It suggested that humanity's greatest vulnerability was not technology, but impulse. If the oval, or whatever intelligence controlled it, was evaluating coherence, then the danger was fragmentation. Competing systems, conflicting authorities, automated escalation without human pause. In that context, the ocean encounters were merely an early chapter, a test environment, a place where pressure, isolation, and consequence converged, and humanity, at least once, had responded with discipline. As analysts closed the file on the Cold War era, they did not mark the phenomenon as resolved. They marked it as dormant, a conditional status that depended entirely on future behavior. One final memo ended with a sentence that summarized decades of uncomfortable insight. Observation decreases when restraint increases. That sentence carried more weight than any threat assessment, because it implied responsibility, not dominance, not superiority, responsibility. If the phenomenon returned, openly or subtly, it would not be because humanity had advanced too far. It would be because humanity had stopped stopping itself. And deep beneath the oceans, where silence has meaning and pressure reveals truth, something that once watched humans balance on the edge of annihilation might still be listening. Not for weapons, not for movement, but for the moment restraint fails. By the time the Cold War was officially declared over, the files related to underwater anomalies were no longer treated as urgent, but they were never dismissed. They were archived differently. Not alongside unresolved threats, but alongside phenomena that required watchful patience. The kind of patience that assumes something is not gone, merely uninterested, for now. A new generation of analysts inherited the material without the emotional weight of those who had lived through the tension. To them, the oval encounters were historical curiosities. Strange, yes, but safely distant. The world had changed, alliances shifted, technology advanced, and yet certain questions refused to age. Why had the phenomenon appeared only near assets capable of irreversible action? Why had it disengaged after restraint, but not after detection alone? Why had it never attempted communication beyond pattern and proximity? These questions resurfaced quietly in the early 2010s when a civilian research vessel operating near a decommissioned undersea cable reported a transient mass moving beneath it. The reading lasted less than 30 seconds. No image was captured. No follow-up contact occurred, but the acoustic profile was archived. Years later, a junior analyst comparing legacy data noticed the resemblance. Not identical. Compatible. That word, compatible, was circled in red. The analyst brought the finding to a senior review board. The response was not alarm, but discomfort. The profile lacked the depth and precision of the Cold War encounters, yet it shared a defining feature. It appeared briefly near infrastructure, then vanished without reaction. The board chose not to pursue the lead aggressively. Instead, they asked a different question. What changed, one of them asked, that would make the phenomenon reduce its proximity? The answer was unsettling. Human systems had changed. Submarines were no longer the primary custodians of deterrence. Responsibility had diffused across satellites, automated platforms, and layered response mechanisms. The clear, isolated decision points that once existed inside a steel hull now existed across networks. Observation, if it continued, no longer required physical closeness. The phenomenon didn't need to follow submarines anymore. It could listen elsewhere. This possibility reshaped how analysts interpreted the absence of encounters. Silence was no longer reassuring. It was ambiguous. Commander Klein, now in his final years, was contacted one last time, not for testimony but for reflection. An intelligence historian asked him a single question during a recorded interview that would never be released publicly. "If it returned today," she asked, "how do you think it would behave?" Klein didn't answer immediately. "It wouldn't need to come close," he said finally. That was never the point. It came close because that's where the decisions were. "Where are they now?" she asked. Klein looked at her. "Everywhere," he said. That answer ended the interview. Behind closed doors, analysts began reframing decades of encounters as a single event stretched across time. Not multiple visits, but one extended observation campaign, initiated, paused, and potentially resumed, depending on conditions. The phenomenon had not been reacting to humanity. It had been calibrating itself to humanity's capacity for restraint. This interpretation was never formalized. It remained too speculative, too philosophical, but it influenced thinking in subtle ways. Risk assessments included language about behavioral stability. Crisis simulations included forced pauses. Training emphasized judgment under ambiguity. These weren't reactions to fear. They were acknowledgments of being seen. One classified workshop explored a final, uncomfortable scenario. What if the phenomenon's absence meant approval? And what if future reappearance meant disappointment? No one liked that framing. Because disappointment implies expectation. Expectation implies accountability. The Cold War encounters suggested that something had once evaluated humanity and chosen not to interfere further. But evaluations can change. Conditions can regress. Systems can become brittle. The ocean had once been the testing ground. The test itself, however, had never ended. As one analyst wrote in a private journal after retiring, "The scariest part wasn't that something watched us. It was that it stopped watching. Because stopping implies completion, and completion implies judgment rendered. Whether that judgment was permanent or merely provisional remained unknown." The final assessment was never written as a conclusion. It appeared instead as a shift in language. Internal documents stopped referring to unknown underwater contacts and began using terms like conditional phenomena and behavior-responsive anomalies. The change was subtle, but it mattered. It acknowledged something no one wanted to state outright. The encounters had never been random, and they had never been about geography. They had been about choice. Analysts reviewing the full arc, from the first Cold War patrols to modern near misses, noticed a consistent pattern that could not be explained by coincidence or sensor error. The phenomenon appeared only when human systems approached irreversible thresholds. It withdrew once those systems demonstrated restraint or recalibration. This was not intimidation. It was measurement. The most unsettling implication was not that something had the ability to follow submarines at impossible depths. It was that the phenomenon seemed to understand when to appear, and more importantly, when to stop. Stopping required judgment. Judgment required awareness. And awareness required humans. That realization reframed everything about the Cold War encounters. The Oval had not been testing firepower. It had been testing governance under pressure. It had been evaluating whether humans, when confronted with the unknown, defaulted to escalation or paused long enough to reconsider. Commander Klein's encounter was still referenced because it demonstrated the ideal sequence: recognition, restraint, disengagement. The mirrored sonar pulse had not been a challenge. It had been a signal of comprehension without aggression. The phenomenon responded by leaving. That exchange became a silent benchmark for acceptable behavior. In the years that followed, as automation increased and decision windows narrowed, analysts grew uneasy. Speed was celebrated, efficiency optimized, human oversight reframed as redundancy. From the phenomenon's perspective, that trajectory was dangerous. Restraint requires friction. Friction requires time. Time requires humans. Without them, decisions become momentum. One internal briefing summarized the risk plainly. A system that cannot hesitate cannot demonstrate restraint. That line never left the building. The ocean encounters faded from active concern, not because they were resolved, but because they had succeeded. The phenomenon had learned what it needed. It had verified that under certain conditions, humanity could interrupt itself. The question that remained, never written, never answered, was whether that capacity still existed. A modern naval strategist put it this way during a closed discussion. If it comes back, it won't be because it's curious. It'll be because it's checking something. Checking what? Stability, coherence, judgment under ambiguity. The idea that humanity might be subject to periodic evaluation was deeply uncomfortable, not because it implied superiority elsewhere, but because it implied accountability here. No invasion scenarios followed from that idea. No weapon systems were proposed. Instead, doctrine bent quietly toward moderation, toward layered confirmation, toward human presence at critical junctions, not fear-based changes, behavior-based ones. One retired analyst, reviewing the complete archive late in life, wrote a final note for himself that was never shared. It didn't attack us when we were strongest. It watched us when we were closest to losing control. That sentence captured everything. The phenomenon had not appeared to threaten humanity. It had appeared to witness humanity at its most consequential moments and then decide whether intervention was necessary. And intervention, crucially, never came. That absence was the verdict, for now, because verdicts can be revisited, and oceans vast and patient remember patterns far longer than politics. The Cold War ended without a shot fired between superpowers, but it did not end without being watched. Deep beneath the surface, where pressure crushes steel and silence carries meaning, something observed humanity at the exact moments when restraint mattered most. It did not intervene. It did not warn. It did not reveal itself fully. It waited. And when humans chose not to escalate, when they paused, hesitated, recalibrated, it left. That choice may have mattered more than any weapon ever built. If this story stayed with you, it's because it challenges a familiar assumption, that power alone defines survival. Sometimes survival depends on the ability to stop, to recognize when not acting is the most intelligent response available. If you're drawn to stories where military precision meets the unexplained, subscribe to Restricted Area Stories. We explore encounters that trained professionals never expected and decisions that quietly reshape doctrine without ever reaching the public. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Because these stories don't belong to one ocean or one era. They surface wherever humans test the limits of control. The ocean may no longer host the test, but the test itself never ended.